The day my son died was by far the darkest day of my life. To a father, a son is his future, his strength, his right hand. And after he had passed away, I began feeling like a very different person. Few people would associate grief with identity theft, but I believe there's a link and that more people should know about it. And when I speak of identity theft, I'm not talking about someone stealing your social security number or your credit card. Rather, I'm talking about your actual identity being ripped away from you by the passing of a loved one. And this type of identity theft is something that others commit on you, as well as something that you do to yourself. I remember that when my dad died 12 years ago, I went from being my own person to, well, the young man whose father had died. For a few years after, people I didn't even know would sometimes walk up to me and say, "Are you Daniel Whitworth's son? I'm so sorry to hear that he died." In the minds of some people, I didn't have an identity outside of my deceased father. When people looked at me, they thought of him. But over time, I outgrew that. As I began to become known for my writing and blogging, I went from being a dead man's son to being the guy who wrote Epic of God. And this was refreshing. I remember telling my wife that it was cool to be known in my social circles for something that I had done instead of something tragic that had happened to me. However, all that changed again when my son passed away last December. And whereas I had once been a dead man's son, I was now a dead little boy's father. In the immediate months after Daniel's death, several people whom I didn't know would approach me and ask, "Aren't you the young man who lost his son?" And yet again, I didn't have an identity outside of my grief and loss. When people looked at me, they thought of him. And I know what you're thinking. Yes, I know that people meant well, and that's okay. But if you've ever walked the road of grief and you don't know how heart-wrenching it can be for your entire identity to be wrapped up in the worst moment of your life, and as long as well-meaning people identify you primarily with your loss, you're always handicapped in the process of moving on. But grief can strip away our identity in other ways, and no one else is responsible for this second type of identity theft than ourselves. Obviously, grief changes us, that's an understatement. But it is the degree to which grief changes us that can be so unexpected. And as I reflect on the 6 to 9 month aftermath of both my dad's death in 2004 and of my son's death last December, I realize now that I began exhibiting very toxic emotions and behavior, and I took up unhealthy habits. At several moments along the way, I'd stop and scold myself internally. Who are you? What are you becoming? This isn't who you've always been. This isn't consistent with your true character. And as a result of some of my actions, both 12 years ago and more recently, I hurt some of the people in my life. I made unwise, unhealthy decisions. But most of all, I hurt myself. And there is some measure of comfort in knowing that some of the things I did are not consistent with who I really am, and I believe God knows that. But I'm also convinced that this does not excuse me from suffering the consequences of my actions. Grief doesn't have to change us in immoral ways in order to hold our identity hostage. All that's necessary is for us to give in to the toxic emotions swirling around within us. All that's necessary is for us to excuse harmful, uncharacteristic behavior with the phrase, "I'm grieving." That may be okay for the short term, but it's never helpful in the long term. So why is all of this important? If you know someone who's grieving, be very careful not to convey the idea that their loss is all you think about when they come to mind. It's certainly appropriate to let them know that you remember their loss, that they are in your prayers, but unless they show a willingness to talk about it, you need to quickly move the conversation on to something else. In all of this, pray that God will give you wisdom and discernment to know what and how much to say. The right words will be different from person to person and from circumstance to circumstance. Some people won't want to talk about it at all and will feel tremendous emotional pain when you bring up their loss. Others will want to talk about it at length. So be sensitive, read their facial expressions and body language, be respectful. Just because you had a similar loss doesn't mean you need to tell them about it or compare notes. Your loss was different, and no amount of "I know just how you feel" will ease their immense emotional pain. And if you're the one who's grieving, then I want you to consider doing two things. You need to give yourself some grace, number one. This isn't a license to be irresponsible, but be easy on yourself. Grief is bad enough. Grief combined with guilt just compounds the pain. And the Psalms talk about how that God remembers that we are made from dust, and this is a comforting thought. Grief or no grief, we are going to make poor choices from time to time. We're going to mess up. The key, however, is how we respond to those bad decisions. And that leads me to my second request. As you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you need a friend to walk with you, a good friend, possibly a family member. But this may not be the best idea. You need someone whom you give power to be brutally honest with you. Someone who can tell you when you're acting out, making bad decisions, or developing unhealthy habits. This needs to be someone whom you trust completely to have your best at heart. This needs to be someone with whom you can be vulnerable. Someone whom you can be humble around. Someone who encourages you to check your ego at the door. Death and grief can be cruel masters, but we don't have to let them control us. Our loss is not the sum of our lives, nor our identities, not by any measurement. You're going to smile again. You're going to laugh again. You're going to move on. You're going to thrive. You're going to continue to grow, progress, and achieve. Our loss is not the sum of our lives. Don't allow grief to steal your identity.